The Spartan war machine was among the most formidable in the ancient world, but how did it work? That is what this video hopes to answer in as short a time as possible. Part 1 covers the Spartan society and economy, showing how these were geared for war. Part 2 gives an overview of the training that forged these fearsome fighters. Part 3 outlines the battle tactics that ensured Spartan dominance in the field. More specifically, we'll be covering the Spartan military around the time of the Greco-Persian Wars. Let's begin. In Sparta, the society and economy revolved around the needs of the army. If the Spartans were to devote their time to war, they needed sound societal and economic support to keep their war machine rumbling along. In the end, they located their support easily enough, in the form of widespread serfdom. In Sparta, you see, there were 3 major classes, each with its own part to play, however unwillingly, in oiling the city's war machine. Firstly, there were the Spartiates, the economically unproductive citizen soldiers of Sparta, who devoted all their time to mastering the art of war. Then there were the Periki, a term that translates roughly to neighbours, the second-class citizens from Sparta's surrounding settlements, who had wide-ranging economic roles, being responsible for commerce and manufacturing, and anything else considered below a free Spartiate. In the words of one historian, they enjoyed self-government but were under the dominion of the Spartiates. In addition, they also supplied troops in times of war, though they were not as formidable as the Spartiate soldiers. Last and very much least were the Helots. To the miserable Helots, their Spartiate overlords gave the most unenviable back-breaking labour. Endless toil was their lot, toil with the sole aim of funding and supplying the Spartiates as they fought in the armies. Land in Lacedaemonia and Messenia was partitioned out between the Spartiates so that they could all fund their military lifestyles, although they were not expected to work the land themselves. No, that honour went to the Helots, who served as waged serfs on the Spartiate-owned farms. The economic surplus produced by the Helots was skimmed off the top by the Spartiates, enabling them to live freely and comfortably within their own remarkably egalitarian social class. The Helots enjoyed very few rights and were kept in a state of abject servitude by their Spartiate overlords, with a curfew being enforced on all Helots on pain of death. Summary killings of Helots by Spartiates were also common. It's hard to accurately quantify the peoples of the Spartan kingdom, but the Spartiates certainly existed as a minority, with the Periki and Helots making up the vast majority. According to Herodotus, each Spartan had 7 Helots at the Battle of Plataea in 479 BC, but extrapolating this ratio to the whole kingdom is dangerous, to say the least. According to Rupert Matthews, by roughly 480 BC there were 7,000 adult male Spartiates, and perhaps 20,000 adult male Lacedaemonians, that is, Periki. With all areas of economic production being left in the hands of the Helots and Periki, the Spartiates themselves could turn wholly to the bloody business of war. They were full-time soldiers, unlike most other citizen soldiers of the classical era, and from birth all Spartiates were trained and moulded precisely for this purpose. Spartiate boys were put through state education, with the aim of turning them into first-class fighters. Even girls got in on the action, enjoying an education that was, at least physically, only a few shades less gruelling than their male peers, though they never actually trained for combat. Forging a fighter began at birth. If a baby was not judged to be healthy enough or possessed any sort of defect, then it was unceremoniously lobbed into a pit that the Spartans charmingly called the dumping ground. In the light of Sparta's no-expenses-spared education program, the state had no wish to waste resources on future soldiers that would not perform to their fullest. Those that passed this early test, both boy and girl, would soon enter Spartiate education. In the interest of brevity, we shall focus on the boys. Aged only 5, they would leave home to live in a barracks alongside other boys, where they learned military marching songs, how to read and write, and went about their days carrying scaled-down, kid-sized armaments. Once they turned 13, the training really began in earnest, and formation marching as well as weapons training became a part of daily life. To foster a culture of self-reliance, the youths were purposely starved by the authorities and forced to steal food for themselves. In the case a boy was caught stealing, he was savagely beaten. But make no mistake, the punishment was not for stealing, it was for getting caught. Throughout this whole ordeal, the youths were not permitted shoes so as to toughen up their feet, and were given just one tunic, regardless of the weather. Competition was fierce and unremitting, but a sense of community was instilled in them too. Even at their 18th birthday, when they finally became men, the Spartiates lived in common mess halls alongside 15 other such men. The total of 16 was, not coincidentally, equivalent to 2 ranks of 8 in an army, and these men would fight alongside one another when the time came. All Spartiates, even the 2 kings, were part of a mess. The 16 men of a mess 8 slept, exercised and trained as one unit under the same roof. Importantly, they fought together too. The point of this was to build unshakable bonds of trust between the men. This was especially important when you consider that on the field of battle, a soldier is stuck wearing a large helmet. He has no peripheral vision. He can't check if his friends have his back. He just has to know. These messes built up the mutual trust that strengthened their morale and allowed them to calmly get on with the bloody business of the day. And it was only at the age of 30, when a Spartiate became a fully fledged citizen, that he was allowed to even sleep at home with his wife. Yet even these privileges were limited. A Spartiate still had to train daily with his mess and dine on the ghastly, ghoulish gruel that the messes served up to the soldiers. Of the food and living conditions, foreigners would often joke. "Now I know why the Spartans do not fear death," one of them japed. The Spartiates, however, failed to see the humour. Excess was a marker of weakness, restraint of strength. This was the philosophy they lived their lives and fought their wars by. There was another aspect to Spartiate training as well. Known as the Crypteia, it was in essence a secret police. High-flying Spartiates would be taken from their messes and drafted into the Crypteia. Their roles here included policing the helots and making sure that no rebellious sentiments were allowed to flare out of control. Given how greatly the helots outnumbered the Spartiates, the overlords lived in a state of semi-paranoia. Their whole system depended on the work of the helots. As such, the Spartiates were loath to let them slip the leash. Every year they ceremonially declared war on their helots, and probably culled them too. It was this combination then, of ceaseless training, nigh on psychotic watchfulness, and ironclad brotherhood between the Spartiate soldiers, that enabled them to go beyond the bounds of normal men, and regularly put to flight armies larger than their own. This potent cocktail enabled them to outmaneuver and outfight other Greeks, using tactics that would be inconceivable to less professional forces, as shall be shown in the next part. In terms of their armaments, there was little that set Spartans apart from other Greeks. They were armed and armoured much like the other hoplite soldiers of Greece, carrying the aspis shield and a dory spear, while wearing a breastplate of either bronze or linen, as well as bronze greaves and a helmet. In practical terms, the only difference was the sword they carried alongside their spear, which bulged slightly towards the end, and thus favoured stabbing motions. Aesthetically, the Spartans immediately cut a dash thanks to their distinctive crimson cloaks. Certainly, for any of Sparta's enemies, the sight of that wall of bronze and crimson advancing must have been terrible, for it heralded, more often than not, the doom of whomsoever opposed it. It was not weaponry, however, that set the Spartans apart, but rather skill and tactics. Their high levels of training and discipline let them pull off various impressive manoeuvres, 3 of which have come down to us in full. The first of these high-level manoeuvres was the outflanking move, which basically worked by having a column detach itself from the side of an advancing phalanx, marching parallel to the rest of the army but further out, and then swinging round and smashing into the side of the enemy force. For this to work, good timing was needed, and good discipline to ensure it worked in one fell swoop. Second in Sparta's military playbook was the feigned retreat, the pretend flight of an army to bait out an enemy. For this to be successful, an army has to enjoy high morale and excellent training, mostly because a pretend retreat can easily become a real one if order is not maintained. The exact details of how the Spartans pulled this off are apparently foggy, but they likely began by retreating the back ranks of the phalanx to an agreed upon point, until only the 2 front ranks remained, after which they would naturally give way, and then the feigned retreat would begin, with the front ranks caving and running away in mock fright. The enemy, thrilled at the sight of the Spartans in flight, would leap at the chance to run them down, growing disorderly and thus vulnerable in the process. Now it was the turn of the Spartans to strike. After quickly reforming, the Spartans would charge their scattered foes, shattering them and driving them from the field. Even if some of the pursuers saw what the Spartans were doing, the soldiers further back would be oblivious, and any chance of restoring order was slim. The final manoeuvre that has come down to us was called the Spartan countermarch. It was less about actually beating the enemy, and more about rapid, fluid, flexible movement across the field. It basically involved the Spartan army changing its direction of march by 180 degrees, without doing a turn, and it worked as follows. To begin the countermarch, every other file would drop back and tag onto the back of their neighbouring file. Then, with the files at double length, the leader of each file turns around and walks through the gaps left. The rest of the file follows him, inverting the direction of march. Now we are left with double-length files pointing the other way. To finish the countermarch, the back half of each file detaches itself and moves into the gaps. The formation is back in place, only now it's facing the other way. The Spartan countermarch enabled them to turn on a dime and respond to changing circumstances quickly, greatly enhancing their tactical abilities. Many thanks to Chris Manger, the channel's console tier member.